Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to discuss are cotton kingdoms, cotton economics, Southern belles, the Mudsill theory, and what life was like as an American slave. There's the outline right up above me that should be included in your notes, and let's go ahead and begin. We are studying the American Civil War. Well, why? Why does it matter? And it matters for a couple different reasons. And one of them is that the American Civil War is the decisive moment in American history. It is this singular event that represents sort of the culmination of early American history. Everything that came before it leads up to it, and everything that comes afterwards flows from it. It solves all of these problems and settles all of these arguments about the United States, about the federal government versus the state government, about a national army versus state militias, about civil rights versus property, and it solves the question of American slavery. And it's all centered on that individual in the stovepipe hat, and I hope you actually know who that is. And one of the things about the Civil War is that it is an extremely accessible event. Yes, it did take place 160 years ago, but one of the things about the Civil War is that we have technologies, we have accounts that allow anyone direct access to the events of the time. Photography was just coming of age, and we have hundreds and hundreds of photographs from the Civil War. It's not drawings, it's not paintings, it's not portrayals of people as the artist thought they should be. A photograph is an image of a person as they were. And we have photographs, not just of generals and presidents and senators. We have photographs of individual soldiers, poor privates, soldiers hanging out at a tent. We can directly see these individuals, and we see how they are experiencing the Civil War. And because most of them were literate, we have dozens, if not hundreds of accounts of people who lived through these events, writing them down, sometimes at the time, sometimes decades afterwards. But we can pick up a book and we can read what some of these people were actually thinking as they saw things that we can barely imagine. This includes things like a 16-year-old Alva Hunter watching the artillery bombardment on Fort Sumter, a infantryman watching horrific battle scenes unfold in front of him, a Southern belle in East Texas complaining that there's nothing to do in Tyler because they're about to be overrun by the Yankees, or so everyone thinks. So the Civil War is accessible in a way that no other event in American history has really been up until now. And in addition, the richness of the Civil War and the drama of the events have inspired filmmakers and artists to paint, to write, and most accessibly, to create these fantastic movies about the events of the Civil War. And it's not just that many films have been made about the Civil War, and it's not just many really good films have been made about the Civil War, but some of the greatest films ever made are about the Civil War. Gone with the Wind, Glory, Gettysburg, The Red Badge of Courage. These are some of the greatest films ever made. I mean, Red Badge of Courage starred Audie Murphy. And these are just the greatest films of all time. And not to mention the dozens and dozens of other films which are set in and around the period of the Civil War. Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, John Wayne's Horse Soldiers, Jude Law, Matthew McConaughey. All of these actors have done Civil War stories, and these movies are very good. All of these movies are incredibly good, featuring what went on at the time. There is just something about the great drama of the Civil War that draws writers and filmmakers and actors to the events of the period, because these are high drama events. And some of these highly dramatic events continue to play out, and the symbols and the memory and the history of the Civil War echoes today, 160 years later. We are in the middle, in the 21st century, of a massive debate about Confederate statues, about Confederate symbols. There's images of General Lee being removed from his plinth, in New Orleans, because some people were offended at this image, the celebration of this Confederate hero. There's another Confederate statue, a monument to the veterans of the Confederacy, disgraced. They were racists. And there's a counter-protester arguing that these Confederate symbols and statues don't represent racism or hatred, but instead they represent the history of the South and the sacrifices of the people who made the South. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, maybe both sides are right, but represent radically different perspectives of the same set of symbols. Right up above me, that's the Mississippi state flag, with 1/4 of it being taken up by the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. It's a Confederate symbol. It's a state flag. In fact, some states, like New Jersey, for instance, controls access to the Statue of Liberty. New Jersey has refused to fly the Mississippi state flag because they said it represents the racism and hatred of the Confederacy that the Confederacy possessed. And Georgia also used to have the Confederate battle flag on its state flag, but they eventually changed that. And about a few years ago, they had a plebiscite in Mississippi. They let the people vote on whether to change the state flag or not. Most people voted to keep it. So these symbols and statues and these ideas still echo, even though the guns have been silent, since 1865. And what we are going to do as history students, what we are going to do as students of these events, is we are going to put a question in the back of our heads. We're going to put this question, and we're going to cogitate about this question as we move through this material. And we're going to ask ourselves this moral question about the American Civil War. And the question is, was the American Civil War the final triumph of liberty over slavery, or a national tragedy of a failed political and economic system? Examine the outbreak and conduct of the war from one of these two perspectives. Was the Civil War inevitable? Could Lincoln have won without resorting to total war? Was all of the death and destruction visited on the South justified? And does the messy post-war period change your perspective on these events? I would strongly urge you to put that question in your notes. Keep it bubbling in the back of your head as we move forward through the material. Now, in American political history, where we left off with the collapse of the second party system. The Whig Party in 1850 is in the process of falling apart, and by 1854, it's completely gone. And the Democrats themselves, the party founded by Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party itself is badly split along sectarian lines. A lot of the issues that we discussed before of cities versus the country, the state versus the federal government, the national bank or state banks, all of these questions, that go all the way back to Jefferson and Hamilton, all of those questions are irrelevant. The only question that becomes important is, can we justify American slavery? Can one part of the nation legally own a third of its own citizenry? And all of this really gets started with the Cotton Kingdom, with American slavery and the Cotton Kingdom. In the years after the American Revolution, everyone assumed that American slavery was in steep decline. The rice plantations were falling apart. The indigo plantations were ceasing to be profitable. The tobacco plantations were all turning into tiny little deserts because they'd overfarmed the land. But Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin at the dawn of the 19th century. There's the cotton gin right there. And at the same time, in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, that's experiencing the Industrial Revolution. And at the center of the Industrial Revolution is large-scale production of cloth, of textiles. So the cotton gin reinvigorates American slavery, and the South latches on to this new cotton, this new product that is going to start making a lot of money, that's going to fuel the construction of Alabama, Mississippi, and large parts of Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Cotton becomes all important, and cotton reinvigorates American slavery. And it reinvigorates it in an incredibly dramatic fashion. You can see right up above me, that's the graph of cotton production in the early 19th century. And yet you can just watch it. It is nearly a vertical graph. And so it's these three things that they put together: land, cottonseed, and slaves. And if they can combine that formula, if they can get it to work, you can make a lot of money. You can make a lot of money. And this is what fuels a great land rush across the southeast United States, an explosion outward from the old colonies of Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Virginia across the entire South. What they call at the time Alabama fever, this rush to get to these Alabama lands and plant them. And the sooner you can plant them, the sooner you can make money, and the sooner your fortune can grow. But one of the problems is that in 1808, the United States comes to an agreement with the United Kingdom, with Great Britain, in that they are going to stop the transatlantic slave trade. After 1808, the African slave trade is banned. In fact, this was one of the great dreams of Thomas Jefferson, was to do this. But that has the side effect of dramatically increasing the value of the slaves that are already inside the boundaries of the United States. So in other words, you have these enslaved persons in Virginia, in North Carolina, who have only half been working on these sort of decayed tobacco plantations. They're not really used to exceptionally hard labor because everyone else thought that the slave system was going to collapse. And suddenly they find themselves very, very valuable. And suddenly they find themselves being chained by the neck and being forced to walk from Virginia to southern Mississippi. And this creates what some historians have called the Second Middle Passage, the forcible relocation of enslaved Americans from Virginia, from the Carolinas, from coastal Georgia, deep into the interior of the United States, into these newly formed states that are being built off of land, cotton, and slaves. And you can see the roots right there on the left. They're being moved forcibly overland. And a lot of them are not used to being treated like this. And it comes as a very rude shock to find that they are not really Americans, chained by the neck with a fiddler in front so that they keep time, and forcibly and cruelly located, marched from one part of America to another, from a relatively soft life on a pretty decayed tobacco plantation in Virginia to a very, very hard life on a cotton plantation in Alabama. This is an act of incredible cruelty. And one of the people that watches these is a young man named Abraham Lincoln. His family lives in Kentucky and Indiana for a short period. And Abraham Lincoln writes later in his life of the complete and total disgust in which he watched these poor people chained by the neck and marched, dragged from one side of the country to another, being forcibly relocated, being purchased in Virginia to be sold in Mississippi. Now, most of the people aren't moved overland. The vast majority of them are loaded on boats and barges, sailed around Florida, and sold in the city of New Orleans. And the city that lies at the heart of this Second Middle Passage is the city of New Orleans. Tens of thousands of Americans are moved through the city of New Orleans, bought and sold to serve the Cotton Kingdom. And New Orleans becomes slavery's metropolis as they move them from Virginia and the Carolinas, sell them in New Orleans. And a lot of very good research has been done detailing the slave trade of New Orleans. And one of the most famous people that is purchased in the city of New Orleans is Solomon Northrop himself. And Solomon Northrop's story it's just incredible. It's too hard to be believed. Solomon Northrop was a free black man who lived in upstate New York. And he visits Washington, D.C., where he is beaten and drugged, finds himself chained on a boat, and is sold in the city of New Orleans at auction. And Solomon Northrop will spend the next 12 years as a slave on various timber mills and cotton plantations in central and northern Louisiana. And one of the amazing things about Solomon Northrop is he gives a first-hand account of what life was like as an American slave. The schedule, how you are at the whim of the generosity of the people who ostensibly owned you. How it was a very harsh but survivable condition, but it was also a condition punctuated by moments of extreme brutality. And you never knew when these moments would occur. But the fear of that they could occur at any time always preyed in the back of your mind. Now, Solomon Northrop himself eventually managed to contact his friends in the North through a secret letter, and they were able to secure his freedom. And that's when he returned to New York and wrote this incredibly sensitive book that is the single best account of life as an American slave. But Solomon Northrop was the lucky one. He wasn't there permanently. There was an end to his servitude. To a lot of the people in those cotton fields, they didn't know that. There wasn't much of a hope other than a hope of some sort of reward in the next life. And the South becomes very, very wedded to the system of slavery. In fact, the South is so committed to it, it will eventually go to war over the issue. So this begs this question: why was the South so committed to the institution of slavery? And basically there are many reasons, but we're going to focus on three of them. One, the fact that slaves represented status and wealth. Two, that slaves largely built large portions of the Cotton Kingdom. And three, that slavery and the Cotton Kingdom delivered wealth and power to the worst kind of people. For one thing, slavery represented status and wealth. You were considered prestigious, you were considered elite, you were considered wealthy and successful, not just if you were a successful farmer, not just if you owned a lot of land or made a lot of money or owned a big and beautiful house. To own other people itself became an important status symbol, not just to be admired by other people, but as a status symbol to your own personal net worth. The people of the South were masters. They saw themselves as masters. And if you are a master, you command other people because you own them. And at the center of this very elaborate and this very beautiful culture of, Southern belles and Southern gentlemen and, sipping mint juleps on the porch of the gorgeous plantation home, the ugly reality was just on the other side of that beautiful plantation home were 500 acres of cotton being picked by 50 slaves who would be physically abused if they didn't do exactly what you said. And those slaves, we know, according to Solomon Northrop, lived in constant terror of the violence that could be visited on them at any moment. The second one we've already addressed to some extent, that Alabama fever, this land rush to put together land and slaves and cotton, largely created large portions of the American South. It built the Cotton Kingdom. It created Mississippi, it created Alabama, it created large parts of Georgia, Arkansas, Louisiana. So slavery represented the basis of where these states came from. It represented not just status and wealth, but the foundation of Southern society itself. The third one we'll get to in just a moment. But first off, I want to talk about exactly how cotton worked economically and why cotton was so important to the Southern economy, which was why they were so committed to slavery. Because the Cotton Kingdom, this land slaves, cotton, this created a society that was essentially an oligarchy. The Southern cotton states developed into an oligarchy, which was ruled by a few wealthy and powerful families. And the way it works is like this, that the economics of slavery dictated that slave-based cotton production works best on economies of scale, which is to say the bigger your plantation, the more cotton you can produce, the more money you will make, and the safer you are from fluctuations in the market. Most of the profit generated by cotton production, by slave-based cotton production, was generated by a few very wealthy cotton plantations. This efficiency allowed the plantations to survive the various panics of the early 19th century, and this trend continued through time. The older a region, the fewer landowners there were, and the larger their farms were. If you compare these two charts, one in 1850 and the other from 1860, you can see that slave ownership becomes more and more concentrated as you move through time. There were more small slave owners in the 1830s, 20s, and in 1850, but then 10 years later, the number of people who don't own slaves at all has increased, and the people who own a lot of slaves has shrank, but the number of slaves they own is even higher. And if we actually dig into the numbers themselves, we see this. These are numbers from North Carolina that represent slave ownership between 1790 and 1860. And you can quite clearly see that what we're seeing is a decline of small and medium-sized slave-owning families in favor of a few very large slave-holding families. Please note the increase of the large plantations with more than 50 slaves, as they go from less than 1% of the landowners in 1790 to 2.2% of the landowners in 1860. And some of these plantations are just gigantic. I mean, if you look at the one in 1860, there's 4 plantations where they own, more than 300, more than 300 slaves. The older the state, the more pronounced the effect. The old states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, these are completely solid oligarchies. There's only about half a dozen families that dictate everything about this state. But as you can see, as you move west into the newer states, they are rapidly developing into these oligarchies ruled by few powerful families. Furthermore, cotton production in the South falls into what is now a well-known economic situation, which is the production trap that develops with enslaved labor and cotton. Basically, the profit margin on cotton gets to be very, very small. And if you can see to the left, that's the price of cotton over time. And while it fluctuates quite wildly, you can easily see how overall bales of cotton lose almost a third of their value from between 1800 and 1860. And this is because they are overproducing cotton. You can see the chart up above. That's the amount of exports. That's the percentage of total U.S. exports that is represented by cotton. And it goes from 7% of exports to more than 57% of exports. Because what the production trap is basically this. The profit margin on cotton is small. So I own a big plantation. Don't judge. I own a big plantation. I make a lot of cotton. The only way I can really be assured of a healthy profit is to make an enormous amount of cotton. But because everyone is making an enormous amount of cotton, the overall price decreases. Because the price is decreased, I have to make even more cotton in the succeeding year. So as people are producing more and more cotton, and as they press upon their enslaved population to produce more cotton, over time, the overall price of cotton drops through time. It becomes harder and harder to make profits off of cotton as we move through the 19th century because they're overproducing the cotton. So what happens is basically this. Because enslaved labor and cotton production works best on economies of large scale, this greatly favors the really big cotton plantations, which means the small and the medium-sized plantations over time are being put out of business. The poor whites and small farmers are basically being ruined by cyclical economic panics and the unstable cotton market. If I own 300 slaves on 1,000 acres, I can weather the fluctuation of cotton prices pretty well. If I've only got 5 slaves on 100 acres, 1 or 2 really bad years, I'm wiped out. The bank repossesses my farm and I'm, GTT, I got to go to Texas if I want to make any money. That as this oligarchy develops across the South, the big farms push the little and small farms out of existence. The small farmers and poor whites are pushed to the edge of society by the ever-growing big plantations. They're either forced into agriculturally marginal land, swamps and forests and hills, or they're pushed directly into the hills themselves, the hillbillies, or they're forced out of land ownership themselves. The poor whites become basically tenant farmers, hands to work the system, or they are dependent farmers. They're farmers who are dependent on the system. And this is actually not an unknown arrangement or an uncommon arrangement, that you would have small farms on the outskirts of a big plantation. But what's happening is that small farm is basically just growing corn and wheat, but they only have one seller, which is that the big farm is making all the cotton, is making nothing but cotton, and they're just selling the food to the big plantation. So basically, to keep this system going, as plantations are getting ever larger and larger, as these oligarchical societies are forming in the East, they are continually pushing this wave of poor whites and poor tenant farmers to the West. In other words, and this is the important bit, and it's so important I've put it into a yellow box of its own, the slave system of the Cotton Kingdom required expansion. It required new areas to expand into, and they all knew this. There has to be some place for these displaced poor whites to go. all right? Because the big plantations are pushing them out. If you're pushed out of Georgia, you go to Alabama. They're pushed out of Alabama, they go to Mississippi, Louisiana. They're pushed out of Mississippi, Louisiana, they go to Arkansas, they go to Kansas, they go to Missouri, they go to Texas. The Cotton Kingdom requires constant expansion to survive. This is why when abolitionists, when the Northern Whigs start wanting to limit the expansion of slavery, Southerners lose their mind, because an attack on the ability of slavery to expansion threatens the entire system with extinction. Now, you have these big plantations. So additionally, you have these big plantations. They're between 500 and 1,000 acres, and generally they're worked by 20 or more American slaves. And what they're doing is that they are actually operating off of a very complicated system of credit, where you basically borrow money in expectation of the money you're going to make when you sell your cotton. And the thing is that what they're using as collateral for that debt are the human beings that belong to the plantation itself. If you look on the lower left, that's the price of a slave over time. And because the United States is not importing any additional slaves from Africa, you can quite clearly see that the value of these enslaved Americans increases over time. So you own a big cotton plantation, you have to borrow money, you have to borrow a lot of money to get the seed, to get the tools, to get everything prepared to plant, and you place up slaves as collateral. Hence, as the price of the slave increased through time, the credit limit itself of the plantation increased. The very functioning of these big plantations depended on the slaves, not just the use of the slaves for their labor, but the use of the slaves for the actual financing for the running of the plantation itself. They can't just free the slaves and have them walk away, because then the plantation would not be able to borrow credit for the next year. The entire plantation would dissolve, it would go bankrupt. Now, the way the cotton system worked is you could grow a lot of cotton. Growing cotton was not a problem. Ginning cotton was not a problem. You could build a huge cotton gin. You could build these industrial-sized steam-powered cotton gins, and they did. That's not a problem. Shipping cotton, not a problem. And the textile mills in the north, or the textile mills in Great Britain, they could handle all the cotton that could be moved. The bottleneck was the picking of the cotton. So cotton gins can process as much cotton as could be picked. The bottleneck in the system was the ability to pick cotton. So the cotton comes out, and if you can get your cotton to the market sooner, you're going to get the best price. If you get your cotton later, you're going to get lower prices. So there is a firm pressure to pick as fast as you can. The more cotton that could be picked, the more likely the plantation can pay off its debts from last year and prepare to pay off some of the debt that's going to be incurred next year. Now, right up above me is the average amount of cotton picked per slave as you approach the Civil War. And you can see it increases steadily throughout the period. Now, partially this is a result of improved strains of cotton that are actually producing like bigger tufts of cotton. But one of the main factors in being able to pick greater and greater amounts of cotton was straight up cruelty. The easiest way to directly increase the amount of cotton being picked was through physical abuse, through hurting your slaves, threatening them with physical violence. On some of these plantations, at the end of each day, they would gather these enslaved Americans together and weigh their bags. The person that had the heaviest bag, who had picked the most cotton, gets like a treat, like a chicken or something, all right? But the person who picked the least, they get 50 lashes. So the next day when they're out there, nobody wants to be that person that's last. In other words, the system is pitting each of the slaves against each other. In short, plantation slavery in the Cotton Kingdom rewarded cruelty and it punished leniency. And the best example of that comes from Solomon Northrop's account from 12 Years a Slave. And in 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northrop is mostly owned by two individuals, William Ford and Edwin Epps. And there they are in the 12 Years a Slave movie. William Ford is a good person. He's called a good person by Solomon Northrop. Solomon Northrop likes William Ford. William Ford is kind. William Ford is caring. William Ford is deeply, deeply religious. He's also someone who believes in slavery. William Ford does not beat his slaves. William Ford does not mistreat his slaves. William Ford has a very good relationship with the people that the law allows him to possess. William Ford goes bankrupt, all right? He doesn't beat his slaves. He doesn't maximize profit. He doesn't move product to market quick enough. He's a good person. He goes bankrupt. His farm goes under. He's in debt. He has to buy everything on credit. And eventually, he has to sell Solomon Northrop. And this is how Solomon Northrop ends up with Edwin Epps. And in cinematic history, like Michael Fassbender plays Edwin Epps as like one of the worst villains you've ever seen on the screen. The man is completely odious. Edwin Epps is an awful, awful human being. He's cruel. He's vindictive. He's mercurial. He'll beat them one day for no reason at all, and then just threaten them randomly throughout the next day. All of the slaves on his plantation in central Louisiana live in constant terror of Edwin Epps. They work hard because they're terrified of him. Edwin Epps makes profit. Edwin Epps gets product to market. Edwin Epps pays his debts. Edwin Epps is rewarded by a system that rewards cruelty, and it punishes lenient people like William Ford. For slave owners, it turned normal people cruel. All right? If you hope to pay off the debt and pass this farm on to your children or grandchildren, you have to do that. You have to. All right? Because it's how you maximize profit. It's how you keep the farm. The Cotton Kingdom turned normal people cruel. For truly good people like William Ford, it bankrupted them, got them out of the business. For just people that were already bad to begin with, like Edwin Epps, it turned them into monsters. And the people who are monsters already, it turned them into the leaders of society. It turned them into governors. It turned them into senators. And this is where we meet James Henry Hammond. James Henry Hammond, the man who wanted to be the Thomas Jefferson of the Confederate States of America. James Henry Hammond is a very successful plantation owner. Very successful. He builds this gigantic plantation in the southern part of South Carolina. Of course, South Carolina. He owns more than 300 slaves. He's extremely successful. He rises to the top of the oligarchy in South Carolina. He's a congressman, 1835 to 1836. He becomes governor of the entire state, 1842 to 1844. And finally, a U.S. senator itself, 1857 to 1860. And he's one of the senators that resigns when South Carolina attempts to leave the United States. And James Henry Hammond builds the cogent argument against the Declaration of Independence. He builds a powerful argument against all men are created equal. He sees himself as the superior of this foolish, naive man named Thomas Jefferson. And it's from James Henry Hammond that we get the above quote. And he's talking about the benefits of secession when eventually that debate comes. And he says South Carolina should secede. The North will never dare invade the South because you dare not make war on cotton. These are his words. No power on earth dares makes war upon it. Cotton, says James Henry Hammond, is king. And that's where we get the phrase King Cotton. But let's actually examine sort of James Henry Hammond's anti-Declaration of Independence. Hammond is one of the principal authors of a document called the Pro-Slavery Argument. He is responding to the abolitionists of the North. So the abolitionists argue that you can't have the ideals of the Enlightenment, you can't have the ideas of the Declaration of Independence and American slavery in the same country. And James Henry Hammond absolutely agrees with them. And this is what he writes in the Pro-Slavery Argument. I endorse without reserve the much abused sentiment of Governor Macduff that slavery is the cornerstone of our Republican edifice. And while I repudiate as ridiculously absurd the much lauded but nowhere accredited dogma of Mr. Jefferson that all men are created equal. According to Hammond, if we have to choose between the Declaration of Independence and American slavery, we throw away the Declaration of Independence. We abandon the ideals of the Enlightenment and we throw away this naive ideal nonsense of Thomas Jefferson. And in the pro-slavery argument, James Henry Hammond articulates something known as the Mudsill Argument. And this is how the Mudsill Argument goes. The Mudsill Argument basically says this: every society has the people at the bottom. Every society has the poor, the outcast, the unwanted, the ne'er-do-wells. These people form the mudsill of society. And a mudsill is the mud that builds up around the base of your foundation, of your house. Hammond says these people, the lowest people in society, the lazy, the indolent, the drunks, these people are mud. They're the mudsill of society. And we can do two things with the mudsill. He says in the North, the lowest of the low, you let these people starve in the streets of New York City. You let them drink away their lives in back alleys. You let these people starve in the backwoods. And he says it is the North that it really cruelly treats the people of the mudsill. But in the South, we have found a more enlightened way to make use of the lowest people in society. We make them slaves. You enslave the people who are not able to cut it in society, the weak, the indolent, the simple-minded. He's also an incredible racist, but I probably don't even have to say that. You enslave these people. You put them to forcible labor. You don't give them access to liquor. You don't give them access to drugs. You take care of them because they are not able to take care of themselves. Hence, slavery is noble. Slavery is a kindness. And there is a paternal relationship that develops between servant and master. The master takes care of the slave, and in return the slave labors from the master, and the profits of that labor are used to take care of slaves. That's the Mudsill Argument. And that is the argument that is used against the abolitionist claim that slavery is un-American because all men are created equal. No, says James Henry Hammond, all men are not created equal. And again, I want to reiterate that from what we know about the Cotton Kingdom, it turned normal people cruel. It turned good people bankrupt. It turned bad people into monsters, and it turned monsters into governors and senators. Because James Henry Hammond was a freaking monster. All right? It's hard to find like true villains in American history. Most of the time, these people are shades of gray because they're real people. You can say, Andrew Jackson did terrible things like the Indian Removal Act, but, he did good things too. He defended the nation from the British. He was for the common man. He attacked these corrupt banks. People are shades of gray. They're good and bad all mixed together. James Henry Hammond is not. James Henry Hammond is a monster. I mean, he's a goddamn monster. And it's hard to find someone as completely awful in American history as James Henry Hammond. James Henry Hammond owned people. He beat people. He beat people severely. He bought and sold people casually. He was a bone-deep racist. He did not think that black people... Oh, man, this is so difficult. He's an awful person, all right? He publicly defended racism. He publicly defended slavery. He attacked some of the core institutions of the American Republic. And I haven't even gotten into the really bad stuff James Henry Hammond I'm just going to say it. James Henry Hammond was a rapist and a pedophile. He routinely raped young girls. We know of, in the historical record, we know of at least 6 young girls he raped, most of which were under the age of 17, and most of whom he was actually related to. He had 4 young nieces. They were aged between 14 and 17. He raped all 4 of them repeatedly while they were very young. He ruined them. He developed a relationship with one of his slaves. He began to rape her when she was 15. She gave birth to a daughter, and Hammond began to sexually abuse his own daughter when she was 12. We know about these things because he wrote about them in a secret diary that was like sealed for 100 years and that was unsealed in the 1980s. He is truly one of the most awful people in American history. He views himself as, I mean, he's not a stupid man. He views himself as this Thomas Jefferson of the Confederacy. He views himself as smarter than Jefferson because he's repudiating the Declaration of Independence with the pro-slavery argument. James Henry Hammond is the type of person who never should have been given any power or authority. Yet he was in direct command of hundreds of people. He owned hundreds of his fellow Americans. He was the governor of South Carolina. He was an American senator. The Cotton Kingdom and American slavery turned monsters into the leaders of states. And that was James Henry Hammond. And this sense of paternalism, this pro-slavery argument, is very powerful in the South. And it's not so much that Hammond comes up with it as merely Hammond articulates it. And a lot of these Southern oligarchs deeply believed this. I have this cartoon which illustrates how they viewed themselves within the Cotton Kingdom. And I've taken the text from the cartoon because it's hard to read, and I've put it right up above me. And I am not reading that. I'm not going to do it. I'm not reading that. You can read it if you want. But this is really how these big plantation owners saw themselves. This is really how the oligarchy viewed their own place within Southern society. So when you ask the question, why was the South so committed to slavery? Because slavery represented the core of their identity. They were oligarchs. They were kind masters, helping these poor, unfortunate people who otherwise would be just lost and confused by a complex society. They were deeply committed to slavery because slavery built the South. Slavery built the Cotton Kingdom. Slavery built their fortunes and their beautiful plantation homes and their positions in society. Slavery was at the core of their identity, of their history, of their culture. So when William Lloyd Garrison makes a cogent, powerful argument against slavery, when Cassius Clay or Frederick Douglass say slavery must be stopped, when they point out things that would common sense tell you, in the very famous medallion up above, am I not a man and a brother? And the abolitionists are pointing out, how can you treat your fellow Americans this way? And the slave owners would give them the pro-slavery argument and say, I am being kind. And it was the accounts of the slaves that kind of pull the curtain back on this identity. And then you start having the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman and Cassius Clay, and these people who are willing to break the laws of the United States in favor of a higher law that all men are created equal. And all of these fellow Americans were men and they were brothers. This is why the Southerners react so powerful to even the ideas of the abolitionists. And the abolitionists are never that numerous. And we can check on the old election returns from like the Free Soil Party. They're representing only about 10% of the electorate. But that's probably indicative of maybe 1 out of every 5 Northerners, maybe 2 out of every 5 Northerners really believes or is kindly disposed towards abolition. The South is very, very sensitive to any challenge of slavery. And in the 1850s, there emerged an entire new type of politician in the South. And these men become known as the fire eaters. And what the fire eaters keep saying, the fire eaters argue that the Southern states, the Cotton Kingdom, the states that embrace American slavery, cannot coexist with their fellows in the North who argue against the institution. The fire eaters are these Southern politicians who argue that the South must break the Union. They argue in favor of a violent uprising, and these people are urging on the Civil War. They are intentionally having themselves photographed, armed, as if for war. The fire eaters of the South demand immediate separation of the North and South, and they want a civil war. And they do everything they can to begin the Civil War. And when the Civil War comes, they embrace it. And all of this is in service to that question right up above. And we've reached the end of this section, and we're about to move on to the controversies leading up to secession and the Civil War itself. And I will see you there.